Have you ever wondered how one man's vision could shape the future of an entire denomination, while also revealing the profound moral contradictions of his time? James Petigru Boyce's life offers a striking story of brilliance, faith, and controversy. Born into wealth, trained in the finest schools, and gifted with exceptional intellect, Boyce became a defining figure in Southern Baptist theology, yet his legacy is inseparably tied to slavery and white supremacy. His life exemplifies both the potential of theological vision and the moral complexity of living faithfully amid a deeply flawed culture. James Petigru Boyce was born on January 11, 1827, in Charleston, South Carolina, into the prosperous household of Kerr Boyce, a prominent merchant and banker, and his wife Amanda Jane Caroline. Charleston, at that time, was one of the most influential port cities in the antebellum South, a hub of commerce, culture, and social prestige. Boyce's family belonged to the city's elite planter-merchant class, enjoying wealth, social recognition, and access to the finest educational opportunities available. Growing up in such an environment provided Boyce with privileges that shaped both his intellectual development and his understanding of social hierarchy, including the entrenched system of slavery that undergirded Charleston's economic and social life. From an early age, Boyce displayed remarkable intellectual gifts. He excelled in his studies at Charleston College, demonstrating a combination of curiosity, discipline, and eloquence that would mark his later teaching and preaching. His academic promise led him to Brown University in 1845, one of the leading institutions in the United States at the time. Known for rigorous classical education and a strong emphasis on moral and religious formation. He graduated in 1847, having developed literary and rhetorical skills that would define his capacity to communicate both in the pulpit and in the classroom. His time at Brown exposed him to a broader intellectual world, connecting him with leading ideas of the era, while also allowing him to refine his emerging theological and moral convictions. After completing his studies, Boyce returned to the South and briefly entered the commercial world of his father. He edited a Baptist newspaper and operated a Christian bookstore, immersing himself in the family's mercantile enterprises. Yet, despite his evident talent in business, Boyce felt increasingly drawn to ministry and theological study. The tension between his worldly opportunities and his spiritual calling would become a defining aspect of his early adulthood. While Charleston's cavalier culture emphasized honor, family reputation, and social prominence, Boyce's personal inclinations were shaped more profoundly by the Puritan ideal. This influence came through his mother's Presbyterian background and the mentorship of Basil Manley Sr., a pastor who had converted Boyce's mother and became a formative spiritual guide for the young man. Under Manley's influence, Boyce developed a deep sense of piety that combined evangelical fervor with disciplined intellectual rigor, preparing him for the theological work that would define his life. Boyce's spiritual awakening occurred during his time at Brown University. A chapel message delivered by President Francis Wayland brought him under intense conviction of sin, awakening a deep sense of personal responsibility before God. The following spring, during a break in Charleston, Boyce devoted himself to intensive study of Scripture, reflecting and praying with extraordinary diligence. This period of spiritual struggle culminated in his conversion and baptism during a protracted revival, meeting under the preaching of Richard Fuller. The experience cemented Boyce's alignment with the evangelical Calvinism that characterized leading Southern Baptists of the era, including Fuller and the Charleston Baptist Association. This formative spiritual experience would shape not only his personal faith, but also his theological commitments and vision for the future of Baptist education and ministry. In December 1848, Boyce married Elizabeth "Lizzie" Ficklin of Georgia. Their marriage became a central anchor in his life, providing stability and a domestic context in which he could cultivate both personal and spiritual growth. The couple eventually had 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Frances, and Lucia, who grew up in a household steeped in both faith and the social expectations of the planter-merchant elite. The home served not only as a place of familial love and domestic discipline, but also as a setting where Boyce could reflect on the integration of faith, intellect, and social responsibility. In the years following his university studies, the religious impressions of his youth matured into a resolute evangelical faith. This faith was coupled with the conviction that his calling was to preach and teach, rather than simply continue the family's commercial enterprises. Although his father initially hoped Boyce would assume leadership of the family business, the young man's sense of divine vocation proved irresistible. His marriage to Lizzie provided personal support and helped solidify his transition toward ministry and theological labor. Encouraged by prominent church leaders, Boyce pursued formal theological training, most notably at Princeton Theological Seminary, one of the premier centers of Reformed theological education in the United States. There, under the mentorship of Charles Hodge, Boyce absorbed the principles of old-school Presbyterian Calvinism, which would profoundly influence his subsequent Baptist theology. He learned to integrate rigorous intellectual engagement with deep personal piety, embracing a view of Scripture as inspired, inerrant, and authoritative for faith and practice. Princeton's environment challenged Boyce to grapple with doctrinal questions seriously, sharpening both his analytical skills and his spiritual discernment. Upon completing his theological studies, Boyce was ordained as a Baptist minister and began serving as pastor of the Columbia, South Carolina Baptist Church. At the same time, he emerged as a rising figure in denominational leadership, contributing to the South Carolina Baptist Convention and participating in discussions that shaped the broader trajectory of Southern Baptist life. His pastoral work combined careful attention to doctrinal fidelity with practical ministry, reflecting his conviction that theological knowledge must always serve the spiritual welfare of congregants. In 1855, Boyce joined the faculty of Furman University as professor of theology. He believed passionately that the future of Baptist life depended not merely on personal piety, but on the cultivation of a trained, doctrinally grounded ministry. In his sermons, lectures, and denominational leadership, he emphasized the necessity of grounding ministers in Scripture, church history, and theological precision. Intellectual rigor, he insisted, strengthened rather than weakened heartfelt piety. Beyond theology, Boyce instructed students in propriety, including table manners, pastoral etiquette, and professional deportment, teaching that a minister's character, conduct, and public demeanor were as important as doctrinal knowledge. Former students recalled his preaching as both fervent and tender, noting the balance between his uncompromising commitment to Reformed theology and his evident pastoral care for those under his guidance. Boyce's life during this period was thus a blend of intellectual cultivation, spiritual formation, and practical engagement with both church and society. He was a man deeply rooted in the intellectual currents of his time, yet profoundly shaped by his religious convictions. His early ministry, education, and family life all contributed to the development of a vision that would later culminate in the founding of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of the most influential institutions in Southern Baptist history. Theologically, James Petigru Boyce was a thoroughly Reformed and confessional Baptist, deeply shaped by the broader Calvinistic tradition while remaining firmly committed to Baptist ecclesiology. He embraced doctrines such as God's absolute sovereignty, unconditional election, and the total inability of fallen humanity apart from divine grace. At the same time, he upheld believers' baptism and congregational governance as essential biblical marks of the true church. For Boyce, these convictions were not isolated doctrinal preferences, but components of a coherent theological system, grounded in Scripture and expressed through historic confessions. Boyce viewed confessional fidelity as a necessary safeguard for the church, particularly in an age of growing theological diversity and philosophical skepticism. Confessions, in his view, did not replace Scripture but served as subordinate standards that protected the church's doctrinal inheritance. They preserved the deposit of truth by providing clear boundaries while allowing liberty on secondary matters. Boyce argued that such confessional clarity strengthened unity by establishing shared commitments without demanding uniformity on every theological question. His lectures at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, later published as the Abstract of Systematic Theology, reflected this comprehensive vision. The work ranged broadly across Christian doctrine, from the divine decrees and God's eternal purposes through anthropology, Christology, soteriology, ecclesiology, and eschatology. Central to his system was the doctrine of representative headship, Adam as the federal head of humanity, whose fall brought guilt and corruption to all, and Christ as the second Adam, whose obedience secured salvation for the elect. Boyce's understanding of the atonement was strongly penal and substitutionary, emphasizing that Christ bore the punishment due to sinners in their place. Consistent with this framework, Boyce affirmed a definite design in redemption. He argued that Christ's atoning work was intended specifically and efficaciously for the elect, not merely as a general provision awaiting human activation. He rejected universal atonement and critiqued mediating positions, such as those associated with Andrew Fuller, as logically inconsistent with particular redemption. For Boyce, any system that weakened the definite intent of Christ's saving work diminished the glory of divine grace and the certainty of salvation. Boyce's theological method was marked by careful scholarship and sustained engagement with the Reformed tradition. He drew from figures such as Calvin, Turretin, and the Puritan divines, while articulating these doctrines in a manner accessible to Baptist ministers and students. He affirmed total depravity, the efficacy of Christ's atonement for the elect, and the perseverance of the saints, placing human ruin and divine grace at the heart of his soteriology. Salvation in Boyce's system was entirely of God, from election to glorification. Doctrinal clarity was, for Boyce, not merely academic but pastoral. He believed the gospel itself was endangered when theological boundaries were blurred. As new intellectual currents challenged traditional Christianity, Boyce defended biblical inspiration and inerrancy, insisting on the full truthfulness of Scripture. In doing so, he anticipated later controversies over biblical authority and positioned himself as an early conservative evangelical voice. Boyce's most enduring institutional contribution was his role in establishing confessional standards for theological education. This vision took concrete form in the Abstract of Principles, adopted by the faculty of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The abstract articulated the fundamental doctrines of grace while avoiding certain divisive questions, reflecting Boyce's conviction that theological educators must distinguish essentials from permissible diversity. Out of these commitments emerged Boyce's vision for a fully developed Baptist seminary in the American South. In his 1856 address, Three Changes in Theological Education, he argued for reforming ministerial training to meet the needs of a growing denomination. He proposed graded courses tailored to students' preparation levels, a faculty of high scholarly caliber, and a binding doctrinal confession to prevent theological drift. These ideas culminated in the founding of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1859. As founding president, Boyce worked closely with John A. Broadus, Basil Manley Jr., and William Williams. Together, they required faculty subscription to the Abstract of Principles without mental reservation, ensuring adherence to evangelical and Reformed orthodoxy. Under Boyce's leadership, Southern Seminary combined learned Calvinism, confessional accountability, and evangelical piety. The Civil War disrupted the seminary's work. Though Boyce initially opposed secession, he ultimately aligned with the Confederacy, serving as a chaplain and later participating in South Carolina's post-war political life. The seminary suspended operations, and its faculty and students were scattered. In the difficult years following the war, Boyce devoted himself to the seminary's survival. He oversaw its relocation to Louisville, Kentucky, and invested much of his personal fortune and energy into rebuilding the institution, ensuring its continuity when many Southern schools collapsed. Yet Boyce's legacy cannot be separated from his deep entanglement with race-based chattel slavery. He owned more than 20 enslaved people and defended slavery both practically and theologically, arguing that it was compatible with Christian teaching. Even after emancipation, he opposed black political equality, once describing the United States as a white man's government. These views reveal the depth of white supremacy in his worldview. Despite these moral failures, Boyce's influence on Southern Baptist theological education was profound. He established confessional accountability, formalized English Bible instruction, and set rigorous academic standards for ministerial formation. Southern Seminary became a flagship institution for Calvinist theology within the Southern Baptist Convention. In recent decades, scholars and institutions have undertaken a critical reassessment of Boyce's legacy. His life now serves as a sobering example of how doctrinal orthodoxy can coexist with moral blindness. He remains a figure whose theological achievements and ethical failures must be held together in honest historical evaluation. If you found this exploration of James Petigru Boyce's theology and legacy insightful, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth studies of church history and Christian theology. New videos are released regularly, examining both doctrinal contributions and the historical realities behind them.